Welcome to this IHS Global Spec Oil and Gas Technology online event. Escalating water handling challenges have a profound impact on the oil and gas industry. In particular, unconventional oil and gas wells require a comprehensive water management strategy, one that addresses regulatory concerns and public sentiment as well as technical and economic issues. This presentation will examine water management challenges critical to unconventional oil and gas operators. Now, before this presentation, we'd like to invite you to submit questions at any point during this presentation by using the Submit Question button at the base of this video console. Also, some of the presentations you will see today include detailed information, so we would encourage you to click the Download PPT button so that you can follow along with your own copy of the PowerPoint slides. Researcher Director Marcus Gay is a member of the IHS Energy Insight team, focused on water information and insight. An expert in wastewater treatment, aquatic ecology, and environmental remediation, Marcus holds a BS in Marine Biogeochemistry and an MS in Environmental Chemistry from the University of North Wales. Marcus, welcome to today's event.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about the future of water in unconventional oil and gas. The presentation that I'm going to be reviewing with you today is the output of many months of research and analysis here at IHS. My team and I have been looking at this specifically now for 9 months, but as a company we've been exploring this landscape and looking at water as a critical challenge for the upstream energy industry for almost 2 years now. So moving on, let me tell you the presentation that I'll be giving you today is broken into a couple of topics, as you see from this slide. I'll start by talking through some key insights, and then I'm going to touch on the global water crisis to try and position the conversation that we'll have. Next, we'll talk about the operational landscape that the oil and gas industry is actually experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll close with a look to the future and some of the key drivers, one of which is an economic driver that looks to be really shaping the way that water management is happening in the US today. So first, let me start with those key insights. The first insight is really around water stress, and I'm not going to read the words off the slide, but I will let you know that water is a global challenge, and it's something that we are experiencing not only in North America. Water challenges are things we're experiencing not only in North America, but in many other countries. And it's one that's really driving critical decision making in the energy landscape. The second component is related to the complexity of water management at what I consider to be a hyper-regional level. And the evolution of different operational strategies that are being employed to manage water throughout the life cycle of a well. Finally, the last component is regards to supply chain management and issues associated with accounting and water management with regards to the cost considerations, essentially. So I'll be reviewing those three things. So just to recap, that's the water stress, essentially, the operational landscape, and then the cost considerations or the financial components of water management. So as I mentioned, let's first start our conversation around the global water challenge. I'm going to run this little video just for a few seconds, and I'll point you to the URL so you can see the full video because it's 5 to 10 minutes long in total length. But I think this is really telling and a really good place to start to think about water management for any industry, not just the energy sector. Whilst this video is playing, what you should see is a number of a movement of pink and blue bars. This is data from NASA. They've collected this information for 10 years, looking at essentially the movement of water around the globe. The pink bars that you see moving up are indicating the withdrawal of groundwater resources from, in this case, the globe. And the blue bars moving down are indicators of rainwater or precipitation events that are happening in these areas. And the real point for this video, and I'm not going to spend too much longer on this, but the point is to point out to you, especially if you are an oil and gas energy engineer, is that water is unlike any other commodity that we look at. It's not fixed at any point in time. There's large spatial and temporal variation in where water is found and located. And here, even at the global level, you see seasonal as well as annual changes in water availability and scarcity. That's a critical thing to pay attention to, this spatial and temporal variability. If I move to my next slide, you can see I've put a series of charts up, 3 in fact, looking at Texas, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania. And what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is time. On the y-axis, it's the percentage of surface area land experiencing heavy to severe drought at any moment in that calendar year. And so the real take home here is that when you zoom in, not from a global level, or not even at a country level, but get down to the state level, there's again a regional variability and spatial variability with regards to water management. These are 3 pretty significant oil and gas producing states. If we look at the 5-year average, we can see that Texas has been experiencing significant drought for a number of years now, elevating that 5-year average. North Dakota has been experiencing drought, more so in the last couple of years, but not as extensive. And Pennsylvania is very low on a baseline, so it's a very water-rich state. If you take that to the 12-year average, you see it's sort of normalizing out between North Dakota and Texas. But the real point here is that between these 2 geographies on the top of the page and Pennsylvania at the bottom of my page, there's a significant regional variability just within the US, which many people would consider to be a water-rich country. The next slide I want to point to is something you've probably all seen before, which is the regional distribution of hydrocarbon resources. And I have a series of graphs that I'm not showing you today, but I'm happy to discuss with anybody if they'd like to reach out to me in person. And it really looks at I think the best term is the hyper-regional water availability or scarcity. So getting down to the watershed level, what is the water availability in a particular region? I'm going to point out on this graph that if you look at the Bakken or the Eagle Ford or the Marcellus, you'll see that these plays cover large regions. They're covering multiple states and multiple jurisdictions with regards to water availability, whether that's a river authority or a groundwater protection council or the state or federal legislation or regulatory groups in that area. But there's a lot of complexity around who owns and manages water and water resources. And in the Eagle Ford, as an example, while there's large availability of, some availability of surface water, but a large availability of fresh water for extraction for energy recovery, there are regions, especially in the southwest corner, where these aquifers are so deep that they're very costly to get access to, and often the case is that they're very briny. In this industry, when we look at the use of water, we think about 4 to 5 million gallons of water being used to hydraulically stimulate this well. And when the analysis is done on a state level, the number is actually quite small. For Texas, it's 0.1% of the consumptive water use used by that state is going to hydraulic fracturing. But the real challenge comes down to the hyper-regional level, going down to the county level, where you look at Dimmitt County and you realize that the water resources required by the industry in that location are actually quite substantial. I've heard numbers that they could be as high as 1/3 of the consumptive water use. I haven't verified that myself, but they would make sense. The next thing I'd like to point to is something I mentioned before, which goes to the regulation around water. In this case, I'm showing you a graphic that was actually created through support of one of my colleagues here at IHS. We queried a database called CyberEggs, sorry about that. And we queried CyberEggs, which is an IHS product, pulled out the data from CyberEggs to look at the number of changes in regulatory code or associated with water on a state-by-state basis. And then we aggregated them by different regions of the country, assuming that the Northeast or the Southwest may have a different general, influence around water. The real take-home is that in the last 4 years, there's been a 400% increase in changes to regulatory code around water. We have a body of research that goes into a lot more detail here. It's not my research specifically. One of my colleagues in-house, or a number of my colleagues, I should say, are experts in the regulatory landscape. So that's as far as I'm going to take it in this conversation. But I'd be happy to talk with you or with any of my colleagues offline if that's something that you'd like to know more about. The area that I'd like to focus on is really around operational challenges and the operational landscape. What I'm showing you now is a block flow diagram. This is very simplified. I think it's important to notice that the operational landscape for water management in the upstream energy industry is very complex, but this is my best attempt to simplify that process. We start with source water, that then is transported and moved into the operations where there's an interaction with the formation to hydraulically stimulate and fracture and ultimately place proppant. I mean, that's a big part of what I'm sure you're aware is happening here, is using the water to fracture the geological structure and then place proppant within those fracture sites so that they stay open to allow for the diffusion of oil and gas. Following on from the next transport, we go into a treatment step. Now, I'm actually starting to change my definition of treatment. By this, I don't mean wastewater or water treatment that you may think of if you come from a traditional water engineering background. Really, this is fluid modification. Any type of modification of the fluid chemistry or physiochemical parameters necessary to either create a fluid that can be used for refracturing or for hydraulic stimulation again, or discharge. That's another component to treatment, is it could be passing the fluid through a process train that would enable you to meet certain discharge or disposal requirements, whether that's downhole injection, as you see here, as one of the options, or surface water discharge, which is the gray line at the very bottom, or disposal through maybe an evaporation approach. But there's a number of opportunities there. Now, I've kind of talked through that, but one of the things I haven't mentioned here is the cost of these different parts of this unit operations of this flowchart. The acquisition cost of water is actually relatively small when you look at the total life cycle cost associated with water management. To put that in context, let's just make up a hypothetical well right now, a shale gas well in North America. You may spend anywhere between $5 to maybe $8 million in capital cost associated with that well. Well, the acquisition cost of water at the front end for a hypothetical well could be as low as $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. It's fairly small with regards to the actual unit cost per barrel. So it's 82 cents per barrel is a price that I've heard of in the Bakken, in the 10s and 20s in Pennsylvania. So that's the kind of range that you would see. But the transportation cost is actually the biggest component here. Transportation can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Throughout the entire life cycle of the process you see in front of you, the little diamond with the letter T indicates transportation, and many of the analyses we've done show that it's 60, 70, maybe 80% of total water management cost is actually transporting this fluid around the operation. Then the next component cost that is of interest is treatment. And again, this is really variable based upon the type of treatment that you see, whether it's a basic filtration, screening essentially to make sure that no wrenches and hard hats are being withdrawn from the water flow. Really high, really basic level fluid screening could be pennies, essentially 20 cents, maybe 50 cents per barrel. But if you increase the level of treatment and thus increase the quality of that fluid, you can really ramp up quite quickly to the point where you're spending $4, $5, or even $6 per barrel on treatment technologies. And so the scale there is quite variable based upon the fluid nature and the fit for purpose for that fluid, discharge or reuse. And then at the back end, we have landfill and disposal. And these are component costs that are market driven. We see ranges, again, in the single-digit dollars per barrel for discharge and disposal. There is some variability geographically, but for all intents and purposes, you've pretty much got a low barrel per unit volume cost at the front end, a fairly low unit cost at the back end, and a very large transportation component based upon not only the dollar per barrel cost of hauling fluids, but the amount of time that these fluids are being moved around. So it's really the component driver for transportation is often distance traveled as well as labor and fuel. So I've kind of given you a flavor for the block flow. I want to talk through some of the specifics. The first one is this, the base case that you'll see probably in majority of the unconventional wells, especially early on, and in many places where there's no constraints around source water or disposal activity. So this is a base case. It's pretty typically seen in many places, very common in Texas as an example, where the source water is used. It's passed through to the operation for stimulating and fracturing the hydrocarbon reservoir. and then there's no treatment. You'll see the blue is indicating the process steps that are actually engaged. So then it's just taken straight through as a liquid waste and disposed underground through an underground injection well. And that's a once through use. And that's probably one of the things that the industry is probably getting the most attention from the public and from the regulatory landscape for, because they will look at this and consider it and see it as essentially a consumptive use of water, a withdrawal that is then disposed of and taken out of the global hydrological cycle. Now, this is often the cheapest option available to operators, and any of the other evolving operational strategies that are coming in have to compete in the market landscape with this as the cheapest entry point. Another one that has been seen most recently has been evolving probably most aggressively in the Marcellus, and that is the once through use but with a surface discharge. And why I say the Marcellus is early on in the development of the Marcellus play in Pennsylvania, there was large volumes of fluid being created through produced water and flowback water. And this fluid didn't have a home. The play was being developed as a new play, and there was not a substantial number of underground injection wells. So in this case, there was a constrained market on the back end of this process flow diagram. And that constraint made operators look for alternative ways to dispose of fluid. And they opted for using an industry standard approach in the region, which was essentially a centralized or treatment plant or a POTW, a private, publicly owned treatment works, and then bringing in that fluid stream essentially for dilution before it was then discharged into a surface water body. That practice continued for probably a couple of years before the Pennsylvania Department of Protection, Environmental Protection, recognized that they were actually causal, that there was potentially an increase in salinity in some of these regions, and ultimately a concern about this practice. So they asked the operators in that region voluntarily to cease that operational strategy and to adopt a different approach for handling that wastewater. And as a result of that, there's probably no surface water discharge from unconventional oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania at present, but this does continue elsewhere. There's an operator I spoke to not too long ago that takes their waste in Wyoming, the produced water, to a treatment facility that then does a treatment and then discharges of it through a surface discharge. But that water treatment plant and technology has been designed to meet a particular effluent limit, in his case under 500 milligrams per liter of TDS. And so this strategy can still apply when the treatment process meets the local requirements. And so that's the balance there of economics between the level of treatment that you want, the quality of the water, and the other available options to you. As I mentioned, in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, and that fluid is now being transported to Ohio, so the transportation component is a lot more expensive. Another component that has been evolving in the Marcellus, and I keep pointing to the Marcellus first because it is a large play, but it's one that has a very unique and almost niche marketplace, driving innovation and driving operational change. This particular process flow is the adoption of evaporation and crystallization technology to ultimately shift the transportation cost from being a water transportation cost to that of a solids handling cost. So instead of pumping and hauling large volumes of water, in some scenarios they look for opportunities to evaporate it completely to the atmosphere. In other cases they may drive it down to meet a 300 to 500 milligram per liter discharge limit, but take the solids waste instead. So it's about shifting the cost and shifting through operational changes, shifting the management strategy to account for this in a different way. The next component to the operational landscape that we've been seeing is the flowback recycling for beneficial reuse. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the different levels of treatment, and there's a lot of complexity to this. But what I want to point to is that the shading in the blue boxes of this process flow are really highlighting the areas where there's high volumes and low volumes of fluid. So in this scenario, much less fluid is coming in from the source side, In many operational situations like this, you will still need some source fluid to make up for the fact that there isn't sufficient flowback coming out to meet the demand in that region. Or maybe because the fluid needs to be balanced, diluted in effect, to reach a certain water quality and prevent scaling. The largest fluid component is being handled through the operational and treatment unit operations here in the dark blue boxes. But then on the back end, because of the ability to recycle a lot of that fluid within the operational landscape, there's much less fluid being transported for either disposal or discharge, and thus a reduction in transportation. This is a practice that is, again, being adopted in the Marcellus. We're starting to see adoption elsewhere. The Eagleford, the Permian, the Bakken. Many of these plays have characteristics to their total life cycle, or total water value chain, that are pushing operators to consider this practice as being interesting or useful to them. Now, interestingly enough, it hasn't been without its pain or without risk or challenge. There was a operator in the Cana-Woodford play probably 2 years ago now, who at that time was experiencing constraints on the front end. They were really challenged with being able to identify a robust and reliable source of fluid to the front end of their operational water management chain that you see here. So they opted to do a recycle and reuse approach, and they also were able to then reduce the amount of fluid that they were using in their stimulations. As a result of that, recently, in the last couple of months, we've seen that operator reporting that the estimated ultimate recovery of the wells that they stimulated using this approach was substantially lower. Now, that doesn't mean to say that this reuse recycle approach doesn't work. That just highlights that there is a lesson to be learned and that there is a need to really understand the engineering and the operational components to do this effectively. There's fantastic results from other sources too. I've seen 2 SPE papers by operators and a recent presentation from a service provider, which all of these sources have pointed to the fact that recycling and reuse of flowback and potentially even produced water can be really beneficial to the well. In one paper, there was talk of a study in Alberta where there was 47 wells that were stimulated through different approaches. One was using fresh water as the source, the other one was using this recycled fluid, and there was an appropriate number of tests per each test unit. And statistically, there was a significant result showing an increase in EUR from the recycled wells, and it's postulated that this is because of reducing the amount of swelling from the shale, and perhaps ultimately just matching that fluid chemistry better with the connate or the formation fluid that's already down there. So I think recycle and reuse is something that we're seeing more of. I want to emphasize that. I do think that it's important to know what you're doing, essentially, to really understand all aspects of this and to go into it with an operator and a series of service providers that can really leverage their best knowledge and prior experience to make sure that this is successful. I think that there's environmentally and also economically a lot of value to this approach. Then the next component to this water management lifecycle sort of operational piece that I'd like to highlight is actually a really new and quite cutting edge component. And this, to put this in context, I want to first point to something that you may or may not know. As the well ages, you see a decay curve associated with the water that is produced. So very early on, within the first few weeks, a typical unconventional well will generate somewhere between 10 to 30% of its fluid volume back within that first few weeks. And then more of that fluid volume is then produced throughout the life cycle of the well, lifetime of the well, so 20, 30 years. That first volume of fluid is called flowback. Because it's typically the fresh water or the fracturing fluid that's injected down, its contact time with the formation is typically quite short, and then when it comes back up, it's still fairly similar to that initial fluid that was injected down. Whereas produced water spends a lot more time in contact with the formation, maybe is even mixed with any formation water that's present, to the point that when it returns, increasingly over the edge of the well, it gets saltier and saltier. Now, for some of the wells that we're seeing, some of the plays that we're seeing in North America, that's not such a big issue. The TDS, the total dissolved solids, that is essentially being dissolved into that fluid, is not too challenging. You may see numbers in the 10s, 20s, or 30 to 40,000 parts per million or milligrams per liter. Where this really becomes a problem is, again, pointing back to my earlier conversation, the Marcellus and the Bakken and some of these other plays where the TDS of the fluids coming out of the well, especially throughout the lifetime of that well, have been getting increasingly salty. And so a lot more TDS, a lot higher TDS throughout that lifetime. The challenge there is when an operator wants to consider doing recycle and reuse on site, they're constrained. There's a number of fluid chemistries available from the service industry to hydraulically fracture and stimulate these wells. Ultimately, at present, they've been designed to be made up with fresh water. I spoke to a service provider who basically told me that this is a function of the R&D scientists that innovated on these technologies. Were doing it in their lab somewhere, let's say Ohio, I'm just making that up, but they're back somewhere using literally municipal city water to do their chemistry. Or at least they were using maybe some fresh water source as a baseline. Now, in these places, as water becomes more scarce or water optimization becomes a focus, they've had to really innovate to develop technologies that enable you to go work with higher TDS. So I think if you think of a slick water frac, TDS typically hasn't been a challenge. But as you start looking towards linear gels, cross-linked gels, and borate or zirconate cross-linked gels, the water quality has increasingly become a challenge and really limited the operator's ability to recycle. So recently the number of service providers, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, maybe others as well, have innovated and developed these high TDS frac fluid chemistries. And the reason I'm spending so much time talking about this is because it really challenges the need for treatment. So early on I said I don't necessarily think of this as being treatment anymore, but fluid modification. And that's really why. I think that modifying the fluid for the use and being able to match that fluid spec is a more important engineering task than just treatment to a drinking water spec. I think that it's going to be environmentally and economically the most advantageous way. And I think it's really, these fluids could be considered a game changer as they evolve and as they gain more market popularity, especially in regions that are water scarce. So I've gone through the full water value chain and talked through a few examples. One thing I like to stop on as I think about it is, what would it take us in the US to take water management from this value chain and the number of different operational strategies I've shared with you to one where we are essentially a net producer of water, where we can ultimately provide water to the hydrological cycle from the formations that we maybe withdraw for our use. And that sounds silly, and a number of people think that that's not possible or that the industry would never get there. But there's a couple of things I want to point to. One is that globally, the oil and gas industry generates 3 to 5 barrels of water for every barrel of water of oil or oil equivalent that it generates. And so really, this is a water, oil and gas industry already. And the question is whether or not we can optimize those water outputs for not only our use, but other beneficial uses. And the other component to my challenge and my question here is really looking at overseas, looking at third parties, looking at the Australian government as an example, who have a different regulatory position around water. They've got a different culture around water. I think that's probably the key thing, is the culture. And companies like Santos and others that are operating in those regions are able to look at the coal bed methane or coal seam gas projects and identify ways in which they can economically put water treatment in place. So all of the produced water that is generated from their coal seam gas projects will ultimately go through a desalination process and make it available to the local communities for agricultural use. Now, this has been done in the US. I've seen examples, I've talked to operators where the operating company has treated water and irrigated corns. Land farming is something that has been demonstrated sporadically, and I have case studies of that. But I'd really like for us to think from a sustainable standpoint. What else is necessary to drive the US and the energy economy towards this approach? So that was a review of the operational components and the operational landscape. I want to focus just briefly on what I pointed to earlier, which is the financial or the cost components. So I'm going to reference some work here. This is a few graphs that I pulled from a white paper that we wrote back in August of last year. We have a new body of work out that's available at present at our website. And I've got the URL at the back of the slide deck here. And again, I'd be happy to talk to you about it offline if that's something you're interested in. But I can't share that work with you today because it's part of an active body of work that essentially we're selling. So these graphs, though, are very compelling and actually very similar to the work that we're doing. Just to highlight the work, one second. We're looking at 13 plays across North America, looking at the 6 components of this water value chain and identifying not only the economical, but the regulatory and other components that really tie in to understand the challenges in the water management landscape. So it's a very comprehensive study. And again, I'd be happy to share those details with you in one-on-one. But for this conversation, let me point to this work. This was the Marcellus. We developed what oil and gas engineers would call a type well. My colleagues and I on the water team were calling it a hypothetical well originally. But this type well analysis is very useful to look at the sensitivity of different operational decisions. And so for this type well in the Marcellus, again, I would estimate probably somewhere around $6 or $7 million in capital cost. What you can see here is that the total life cycle water costs are somewhere around $1 million, which is quite a substantial amount of money in total. But the challenge is it's often segregated and broken into many different buckets, often shared at different points throughout that process. So it could be drilling, it could be completions, it could be production, or in the case of one conversation I've had with an operator, they push some of their water costs into their midstream group. So the costs are often rarely seen in this aggregated format, so it's probably a little bit higher than you may have anticipated. But also the Marcellus is also a very expensive play with regards to water management. The point on the graph, though, is that there's multiple scenarios that one can model, whether that's once through discharge, which is number one, or maybe it's some portion of recycle for beneficial reuse on site, number two. Or number three is suggesting that there's a reason, whether it be regulatory or operationally, for all of the fluid to be recycled and reused on site. In number two, it was only 50% of the produced or flowback fluids. And then number four is actually a scenario looking at what if all of that fluid needs to be recycled and reused on site, recycled and reused, but made available for local agricultural or beneficial reuse outside of the energy sector. And that requires a higher degree of treatment, so that cost is increased. But every step of the way, you'll notice that the dark blue bar is reduced. And that's the reduction in transportation, and that's really critical. Fluid management, to me, is the balancing act between the industry's social license to operate and the well performance or economic performance of that well or that play. And transportation really is sitting there at that fulcrum. It's this balancing act between how do I move the fluid, what type of water quality can I get away with so I can transport it the least, the shortest distance within these plays. And then as the plays are maturing and as people are moving into new plays, optimizing your drilling programs so that you can be thinking around that fluid management is key. I'll point to an operator here and I'll say there's an operator in the Fayetteville play who I think is really leading the way in that area with regards to integrating water management in-house. And that's through the supply chain integration of water transportation as well as water treatment and also water treatment for discharge or disposal. But the real key is the transportation piece. And it was a bit of a shock to me when I found out that they had gone in-house, had built a team of 40 or so water professionals to really manage their water process. And I think that that's something we may see more of, the vertical integration of water management services in companies. So focusing on the hypothetical well model, I want to talk about the sensitivity. So in this graph, I'm showing essentially the landscape. The left chart has transportation cost factor. So that's essentially normalizing each of the cost of transportation for the model, one of the hypothetical models you saw before. And then on the y-axis, we have the treatment costs. And so as the treatment costs are going up, you see that you shift yourself from maybe the pale, pale green up into a dark green. Those triangles are really illustrating the sort of the economic landscape that an operator is playing within on those two factors or two components. So for number one, that is our base case. That's the hypothetical well that was the lowest cost optimized system that we saw in the Marcellus. Then we did some sensitivity and said, okay, that's great, but that's based upon today's prices. What happens if the price for service changes? Maybe there's a market dynamic, supply and demand constraint that causes an inequality to drive up the cost, in this case of treatment. So if we look up here at number 2, the cost of treatment has now increased by a factor of 3, which is forcing us into a no treatment region. So we realize now that treatment is now no longer economical. It's logical, it makes sense, but it's really useful to see it, I think, in this framework. If you now move from number 1 to number 3, and we've increased the cost of transportation by a factor of 3, we now see that it doesn't make sense anymore to treat 100% of that fluid. Instead, it makes sense to treat a fraction of that fluid. And that, I think, is compelling because that's what we are seeing in the Marcellus. The cost for transportation is huge there. They are having to travel 6 to 8 hours to get to an underground injection disposal well. And so there is this trade-off between how far they will travel and how much of their fluid they will process. Now, the fourth one, which is interesting, is the shift in the disposal costs. So if there's a constraint around the underground injection market, again, this is something that, as I mentioned before, in the Marcellus we already see in place, but in Texas and some of the other states that are supporting oil and gas operations, there's, I think, an evolution or a movement towards tightening the underground injection marketplace. There was just recently a conversation I had with the Texas Railroad Commission that not only pointed to a potential surcharge that they'll be adding to the disposal cost, but also just a fundamental driver to try and move Texas to a state which injects less fluid down into these injection wells and makes it available for beneficial use. But the point here is that if you change the economic the price of any of these services, that landscape changes considerably, and you see that by the change in the triangles. Essentially, they're no longer triangles. And in this scenario, when we changed the disposal cost by a factor of 3 from what we currently see, you are absolutely compelled to no transportation and full treatment of flowback and produced water for local use. And so I think it's really important to understand that sensitivity. But the cost factor piece, I think, is useful because IHS is a firm with many different assets. One of the things we have as a legacy group is Global Insight and a number of macro and micro economists. There's a regional forecasting team that I've been working with to look at the cost of water hauling and transportation. And so if I move to my next slide, what we can look at here is that cost factor for transportation. Before I was talking about a shift from 1 to maybe 1.2 or 1.4 as being quite meaningful with regards to changing the decisions an operator may want to make within a region. Well, this data set along the x-axis is time, along the y-axis is that transportation factor. And the graph is actually a composite of many, many lines. So I can't share with you in this forum the full data set. It's something that our clients for our research report will be able to see this cost index as well as many other cost component indices throughout the full water market value chain, the treatment costs, storage costs, etc. But this one, the transport one, is quite interesting because you can see an interesting trend. The average cost of transportation in the US moves along over the last 4 or 5 years at a fairly steady rate of about 19%. But then, that was 8 years ago to about 4 years ago. In the last 4 years, there's been a big increase And you see that the red line getting a lot steeper, and you see a 45% increase in growth over the last 4 years on that average. Now the upper limits and the lower limits are driven by the regional variability. So like I said before, this is a composite of many states looking across the US, so you can really piece together what the transportation component costs would be for a particular play or region that you're working in. And then the future is a forecast based upon our regional forecasting team's expertise. And we see it normalizing and steadying back down to an 18%. But the really interesting thing for me that I want to really point out, and you've probably noticed, is the spread. Initially, there was about a 20% spread regionally. We've then seen that increase to a 72% spread with regards to the regional variability. And our projection right now is that that spread will continue to increase as water management becomes much more localized, regionalized, and the transportation of fluid by truck is going to continue to be a driving factor with regards to the social as well as the economic considerations of water management. So in review, I just wanted to point out and go back to my earlier statements, which is that water management is a global challenge. We're aware that there's a deficit between global supply and global demand. Then the second component is the operational landscape and the evolution of that landscape, and how operators are really being driven, in my mind, between the well performance costs and the economics, essentially, of the well, and then the social license to operate that they're balancing on the other side, with transportation being this really sort of the key fulcrum. And then the final component is the hyper-regional nature. Really, it's coming down to what's happening at the watershed level, and what is an operator able to do on a sort of a well-to-well basis to operate, to optimize their water management strategy and start thinking and projecting as they're developing that play. So thank you for your time. At this point, I'm happy to consolidate some of the questions that have been coming in and do a Q&A.
Marcus, thanks so much for that informative presentation. It looks like we do have a few questions from the attendees, so let's get right to them. Okay, the first question asks, you show an increase in regulation. What role does this play in this space, and how will it evolve going forward?
That's a great question. They definitely, I did show a graph, the hockey stick, here we go, a graph where there has been an increasing regulation. I think the real key is that the regulatory landscape affects this industry at the front end and the back end more aggressively. We're going to potentially see tightening around the availability and use of water. We could look, like I said before, to Australia as an example for that, with regards to that operating landscape being tightened around the availability of water, and then forcing operators to make it available to other industries. But then on the back end, I think the really compelling piece that we need to acutely follow is going to be the underground injection well disposal. The regulatory landscape is driven not only by a concern about discharging water and taking it out of the hydrological cycle, but also concerns about induced seismicity of overpressurizing these faults, and just generally the concern around using a water resource or disposing of a water resource and making it not available. So I think the front end and the back end are the two areas where we're going to see the most regulatory changes in the future.
What technology advancements would be game changers?
So that's a good question. I've seen, as I mentioned before, this high TDS fluid chemistry is definitely a game changer in my mind. It's kind of subtle because a lot of people were familiar with high TDS tolerant fluid chemistries, particularly with slick water fracs. The cross-link gels that are high TDS tolerant is a huge game changer, I think. But also, you could look at water treatment. That position is saying, let us find a chemistry that is essentially agnostic or tolerant to whatever chemicals are in that fluid stream. The other way to look at it is to stay with the existing fluid chemistries and say, let's find a fluid treatment technology that is cost competitive but able to provide you a fit for use fluid. And so the water treatment landscape right now, I think, more often than not, there's a few exceptions, but more often than not, it's bolting together existing treatment process steps, so a dissolved air flotation unit or electrocoagulation or some kind of filtration technology, but piecing together pretty traditional technologies that have been around decades. And I'm pretty sure, because I've been talking to some local innovators and students just here at MIT near our offices, and there are technologies coming out of the academic landscape that could be targeting particular ions or optimizing for particular chemistry that could be game changers down the road, especially if their costs are there.
What is the future looking like, and how are operators adapting to water challenges?
It's a good one. So there's two parts to that, and I think I'll address it by pointing to the research that we have available right now, without trying to undermine that research because it's available. But the one part of that is the operational landscape. So the operating community is seeing a lot more fluid. They're seeing produced and flowback water volumes increasing in areas where there's drilling, and we have play-by-play projections that are showing billions of barrels being generated per annum in our forecasts. And so by understanding the fluid projections in a particular play, which is driven predominantly from a well-balanced, market-constrained well count, not just a rig count, but a well-balanced forecast there, we're able to look at where there will be essentially pain points in the future, where there'll be a surplus of water, an excess of water that might need to be managed or disposed of. Operators are also looking at the water chemistry. As I mentioned before, throughout the age of the well, the fluid chemistry changes, the water gets saltier. Well, as the play ages, that average water chemistry content, TDS, will increase as well. And at some point in a play, there will be a tipping point or an intersect between where the technologies available today are not necessarily meeting with the water quality that you need. And so there will be this need for optimization, spatially and temporally over time, to make sure that you've put in place the strategies. The operator in the Fayetteville that I mentioned before emphasized to me that the reason why they're engaged in water management to the extent they are is because they're in for the long run. And if you're in for the long haul, then you need to be paying attention to what the water will look like and both volumes, quantity and quality in the next 20 years.
Okay, Marcus, those are all the questions we have for now. We'd certainly like to thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today. Now, before moving on to explore the exhibit hall of this event, please take a moment to click the Take Survey button and let Marcus know how he did today. Your feedback helps us improve the quality of our IHS Global Spec events, making them an even better investment of your time. Now, in between sessions, head to the exhibit hall where you'll find manufacturer product reps, engineers, technical specialists, and other professionals waiting to answer your questions. Remember, you can see any of today's presentations during our on-demand period, but exhibitor representatives are only here on the day of the live event, so spend time with them while you can. Please experience our latest innovation, the Knowledge Exchange, offering product demonstrations and our hot topic audio briefs. The Knowledge Exchange is also home to our Event Prize Center, so make it a point to visit. Share your thought leadership point of view by speaking at one of our events. You can find the speaker submittal form at our event help desk in the exhibit hall. Well, we'd certainly like to thank you for choosing to spend your day with us, and we'll see you back here in the conference center a little later on.